Okay, so obviously I'm at home. They sent all of the Milton teachers home out of abundance of precaution. So I am going to read the next section of the Glass Castle from my dining room table and hope that my cats don't try and intervene at any point in time, which I'm looking at Farley right now, and he's already looking over here like he's going to interrupt. So I am starting at the section that says we were always doing the skedaddle. So if you're watching these videos in order, it's the section immediately after the previous one. We were always doing the skedaddle, usually in the middle of the night. I sometimes heard Mom and Dad discussing the people who were after us. Dad called them henchmen, bloodsuckers, and the Gestapo. Sometimes he would make mysterious references to the executives from Standard Oil who were trying to steal the Texas land that Mom's families owned, and the FBI agents who were after Dad for some dark episode that he never told us about because he didn't want to put us in danger too. Dad was sure a posse of federal investigators was on our trail, that he smoked his unfiltered cigarettes from the wrong end. That way, he explained, he burned up the brand name, and if people who were tracking us looked into the ashtray, they'd find unidentifiable butts instead of palm malls that could be traced to him. Mom, however, told us that the FBI wasn't really after Dad. He just liked to say that they were because it was more fun having the FBI on your tail than bill collectors. We moved around like nomads. We lived in a dusty little mining town in Nevada, Arizona, California. They were usually nothing but a tiny cluster of sad, sunken shacks, a gas station, a dry goods store, and a bar or two. They had names like Needle and Bouse, Pie, Goffs, and Y. And they were near places like Superstition Mountains, the dried up Soda Lake, and the Old Woman Mountain. The more desolate and isolated a place was, the better Mom and Dad liked it. Dad would get a job as an electrician or an engineer in a gypsum or a copper mine. Mom liked to say that Dad could talk Blue Street, spinning tales of jobs he'd never had and college degrees he'd never earned. He could get out about any job he wanted. He just didn't like keeping it for long. Sometimes he made money gambling or doing odd jobs. When he got bored or was fired, or the unpaid bills piled up too high, or the lineman from the electrical company found out that he had hot-wired our trailer to the utility pole, or the FBI was closing in, we packed up in the middle of the night and took off, driving until Mom and Dad found another small town that caught their eye. Then we'd circle around, looking for houses with for rent signs stuck in the front yard. Every now and then, we'd go to stay with Grandma Smith, Mom's mom, who lived in a big white house in Phoenix. Grandma Smith was a West Texas flapper who loved dancing and cussing and horses. She was known for being able to break the wildest broncs and helped Grandpa run the ranch up near Fish Creek Canyon, Arizona, which was west of Bullhead City, not too far from the Grand Canyon. I thought Grandma Smith was great, but after a few weeks, she and Dad would always get into some nasty hollering match. It might start with Mom mentioning how short we were on cash. Then Grandma would make a snide comment about Dad being shiftless. Dad would say something about selfish old crones with more money than they knew what to do with. And soon enough, they'd be face to face in what amounted to a full-fledged cussing contest. "You flea-bitten drunk," Grandma would scream. "You goddamn flint-faced hag," Dad would shout back. "You no-good two-bit pud-sucking bastard. You scaly castrating banshee bitch." Dad had more inventive vocabulary, but Grandma Smith could outshout him. Plus, she had at-home court advantage. A time would come when Dad had enough, and he'd tell us kids to get in the car. Grandma would yell at Mom not to let that worthless horse's ass take her grandchildren. Mom would shrug and say there's nothing she could do about it. He was her husband. Off we'd go, heading out into the desert in search of another house for rent in another little mining town. Some of the people who lived in those towns had been there for years. Others were rootless, like us, just passing through. They were gamblers or ex-cons or veterans or what Mom called loose women. There were old prospectors, their faces wrinkled and brown from the sun like dried up apples. The kids were lean and hard, with calluses on their hands and feet. We'd make friends with them, but not close friends because we knew we'd be moving out sooner or later. We might enroll in school, but not always. Mom and Dad did most of our teaching. Mom had us all on reading books with pictures by the time we were 5, and Dad taught us math. He also taught us the things that were really important and useful, like how to tap out Morse code and how we should never eat the liver of a polar bear because all the vitamin A in it could kill us. He allowed us to aim and fire his pistol, how to shoot Mom's bow and arrow, and how to throw a knife by the blade so that it landed in the middle of a target with a satisfying whack. By the time I was 4, I was pretty good with Dad's pistol, a big black 6-shot revolver, and could hit 5 out of 6 beer bottles on 30 paces. I'd hold the gun with both hands, sight down the barrel, and squeeze the trigger slowly and smoothly until with a loud clap the gun kicked and the bottle exploded. It was fun. Dad said my sharpshooting would come in handy if the feds ever surrounded us. Mom had grown up in the desert. She loved the dry, crackling heat, the way the sky at sunset looked like a sheet of fire, and the overwhelming emptiness and severity of all that open land that had once been huge ocean bed. Most people had trouble surviving in the desert, but Mom thrived there. She knew how to get on by next to nothing. She showed us which plants were edible and which were toxic. She was able to find water when no one else could, and she knew how little of it you needed. She taught us that you could wash yourself up pretty good with just a cup of water. She said it was good for you to drink unpurified water, even ditch water, as long as animals were drinking from it. Chlorinated city water was for namby-pamby, she said. Water from the wild helped build up your antibodies. She also taught us toothpaste was for namby-pambies. At bedtime, we'd shake a little baking soda into the palm of one hand, mix in a dash of hydrogen peroxide, then use our fingers to clean our teeth with a fizzing paste. I loved the desert too. When the sun was in the sky, the sand would be so hot that it would burn your feet if you were the kind of kid who wore shoes. But since we always went barefoot, our soles were as tough and thick as cowhide. We'd catch scorpions and snakes and horny toads. We'd search for gold, and when we couldn't find it, we'd collect other valuable rocks like turquoise and garnets. There'd be a cool spell come sundown when the mosquitoes would fly in so thick that the air would grow dark with them. Then at nightfall, it turned so cold that we usually needed blankets. There were fierce sandstorms. Sometimes they hit without warning, and other times you knew one was coming when you saw batches of dust devils swirling and dancing their way across the desert. Once the wind started whipping in the sand, you could only see a few feet in front of your face. If you couldn't find a house or a car or a shed to hide in when the sandstorm started, you had to squat down and close your eyes and mouth real tight and cover your ears and bury your face in your lap until it passed, or else your body cavities would fill with sand. A big tumbleweed might hit you, but they were light and bouncy and didn't hurt. If the sandstorm was really strong, it knocked you over and you rolled around like you were a tumbleweed. When the rains finally came, the skies darkened and the air became heavy. Raindrops the size of marbles came pelting out of the sky. Some parents worried that their kids might get hit by lightning, but Mom and Dad never did, and they never let us go out and play in the warm, driving water. We splashed and sang and danced. Great bolts of lightning cracked from low-hanging clouds, and thunder shook the ground. We gasped over the most spectacular bolts, as if we were all watching it at fireworks shower. After the storm, Dad took us to the Astrios, and we watched the flash floods come roaring through. The next day, the seguros were prickly pears were fat from drinking as much as they could because they knew it might be a long, long time until the next rain. We were sort of like the cactus. We ate irregularly, and when we did, we'd gorge ourselves. Once, when we were living in Nevada, a train full of cantaloupes heading east jumped the track. I had never eaten cantaloupes before, but Dad brought home crates and crates of them. We had fresh cantaloupe, stewed cantaloupe, even fried cantaloupe. One time in California, the grape pickers went on strike. The vineyard owners let people come and pick their own grapes for $0.05 a pound. We drove about 100 miles to the vineyards, where the grapes were so ripe they were about to burst on the vine in bunches bigger than my head. We filled our entire car full of green grapes, the trunk, even the glove compartment, and Dad piled stacks in our laps so high we could barely see over the top. For weeks afterward, we ate green grapes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. All this running around and moving was temporary, Dad explained. He had a plan. He was going to find gold. Everybody said Dad was a genius. He could build or fix anything. One time, when a neighbor's TV set broke, Dad opened the back and used a macaroni noodle to insulate some crossed wires. The neighbor couldn't get over it. He went around telling everyone in town that Dad sure knew how to use his noodle. Dad was an expert in math and physics and electricity. He read books on calculus and logarithmic algebra and loved what he called the poetry and symmetry of math. He told us about the magic qualities of and every number has and how numbers unlock the secrets of the universe. But Dad's main interest was energy, thermal energy, nuclear energy, solar energy, electrical energy, and energy from the wind. He said there were so many untapped sources of energy in the world that it was ridiculous to be burning all that fossil fuel. Dad was always inventing things too. One of his most important inventions was a complicated contraption he called the prospector. It was going to help us find gold. The prospector had a big flat surface about 4 feet high and 6 feet wide, and it rose up in the air at an angle. The surface was covered with horizontal stripes of wood separated by gaps. The prospector would scoop up dirt and rocks and sift through the maze of wooden strips. He could figure out whether a rock was gold by the weight. It would throw out the worthless stuff and deposit the gold nuggets in a pile, so whenever we needed groceries, we could go out back and grab ourselves a nugget. At least that's what we would be able to once Dad finished building it. Dad let Brian and me help him work on the prospector. We'd go out behind the house and I'd hold the nails while Dad hit them. Sometimes he'd let me start the nails and then he'd drive them in with one hard blow from the hammer. The air would be filled with sawdust and the smell of freshly cut wood and the sound of hammering and whistling, because Dad always whistled while he worked. In my mind, Dad was perfect, although he did have what Mom called a little bit of a drinking situation. There was what Mom called Dad's beer phase. We could handle all that. Dad drove fast and sang really loud, and locks of his hair fell in his face, and life was a little bit scary, but still a lot of fun. But when Dad pulled out a bottle of what Mom called the hard stuff, she got kind of frantic, because after working on the bottle for a while, Dad turned into an angry-eyed stranger who threw around furniture and threatened to beat up Mom or anyone else who got in his way. When he'd had his fill of cussing and hollering and smashing things up, he'd collapse. But Dad drank hard liquor only when we had money, which wasn't often, so life was mostly good in those days. Every night, when Lori, Brian, and I were about to go to sleep, Dad told us bedtime stories. They were always about him. We'd be tucked in our beds, lying under our blankets in the desert, the world dark except for the orange glow from his cigarette. When we took a long draw, it lit up just enough for us to see his face. "Tell us a story about yourself, Dad," we'd beg him. "Aw, you don't want to hear another story about me," he'd say. Yes, we do, we'd insist. "Well, okay," he'd say. He'd pause and chuckle at some memory. "There's many a damn foolhardy thing that your old dad has done before this once harebrained, even for crazy son of a bitch like Rex Walls." And then he'd tell us about how, when he was in the Air Force and his plane's engine conked out, he made an emergency landing in a cattle pasture and saved himself and his crew. Or about the time he wrestled a pack of wild dogs that had surrounded a lame Mustang. And then there was the time he fixed a broken sluice gate on the Hoover Dam and saved the lives of thousands of people who would have drowned if the dam had burst. There was also the time that he went AWOL in the Air Force and got to get some beer, and while he was at the bar, he caught a lunatic who was planning to blow up the airbase, which went to show that occasionally it paid to break the rules. Dad was a dramatic storyteller. He always started out slow with lots of pauses. "Go on. What happened next?" we'd ask, even if we already heard the story before. Mom giggled or rolled her eyes when Dad told his stories, and he glared at her. If someone interrupted his storytelling, he got mad. We would have to beg him to continue and promise that no one would interrupt again. Dad always fought harder, flew faster, and gambled smarter than everyone else in his stories. Along the way, he'd rescue some women and children, and even men who weren't strong enough and clever. Dad taught us all the secrets of heroics. He showed us how to straddle a wild dog and break his neck, and where to hit a man in the throat so you could kill him with one powerful jab. But he assured us that as long as he was around, we wouldn't have to defend ourselves, because by God, anyone who so much laid a finger on any of Rex Walls' children was going to get their butts kicked so hard that you could read Dad's shoe size on their ass. When Dad wasn't telling us about the amazing things he had already done, he was telling us about the wondrous things he was going to do, like build the glass castle. All of Dad's engineering skills and mathematical genius were coming together in one special project, a great big house he was going to build us in the desert. It would have a glass ceiling and thick glass walls and even a glass staircase. The glass castle would have solar cells on the top that would catch the sun's rays and convert them into electricity for heating and cooling and running all the appliances. It would even have its own water purification system. Dad had worked out the architecture and the floor plans and most of the mathematical calculations. He carried around the blueprints for the glass castle wherever we went, and sometimes he'd pull them out and let us work on the designs for our rooms. All we had to do was find gold, Dad said, and we were on the verge of that. Once he finished the prospector and we struck it rich, he'd start work on our glass castle. As much as Dad liked to tell stories about himself, it was almost impossible to get him to talk about his parents or where he was born. We knew he came from a town called Welch in West Virginia, where a lot of coal was mined, and that his father had worked as a clerk for the railroad, sitting every day in a little station house writing messages on pieces of paper that he held up on a stick for passing train engineers. Dad had no interest in a life like that, so he left Welch when he was 17 to join the Air Force and become a pilot. One of his favorite stories, which he must have told us 100 times, was about how he met and fell in love with Mom. Dad was in the Air Force and Mom was in the USO, but when they met, she was on leave visiting her parents at the cattle ranch near the Fish Creek Canyon. Dad and some of his Air Force buddies were on a cliff in a canyon trying to work up the nerve to dive into the lake 40 feet below when Mom and a friend showed up. Mom was wearing a white bathing suit, showed off her figure and her skin, which was dark in the Arizona sun. She had light brown hair that turned blonde in the summer, and she never wore any makeup except deep red lipstick. She looked just like a movie star, Dad always said, but hell, he'd met lots of beautiful women before, and none of them had ever made him weak in the knees. Mom was different. He saw right away that she had a true spirit. He fell in love with her the split second he laid eyes on her. Mom walked up to the Air Force men and told them that diving off the cliff was no big deal. She'd been doing it since she was little. The men didn't believe her. Mom went right to the edge of the cliff and did a perfect swan dive into the water below. Dad jumped in after her. No way in hell, he'd say, he was letting a fine broad like that get away from him. What kind of dive did you do? I asked whenever he told the story. A parachute dive. Without a parachute, he always answered. Dad swam away after Mom, and right there in the water, he told her he was going to marry her. 23 men had already proposed to her, Mom told Dad, and she had turned them all down. What makes you think I'd accept your proposal, she said. I didn't propose to you, Dad said. I told you I was going to marry you. 6 months later, they got married. I always thought it was the most romantic story I'd ever heard, but Mom didn't like it. She didn't think it was romantic at all. I had to say yes, Mom said. Your father wouldn't take no for an answer. Besides, she explained, she had to get away from her mother, who wouldn't let her make even the smallest decisions on her own. I had no idea your father would be even worse. Dad left the Air Force after he got married because he wanted to make a fortune for his family, and he couldn't do that in the military. In a few months, Mom was pregnant. When Lori came out, she was mute and bald as an egg for the first 3 years of her life. Then suddenly, she sprouted curly hair, the color of a new penny, and started speaking nonstop. But it sounded like gibberish, and everyone thought she was addled, except for Mom, who understood her perfectly and said she had an excellent vocabulary. A year after Lori was born, Mom and Dad had a second daughter, Mary Charlene, who had coal-black hair and chocolate brown eyes, just like Dad. But Mary Charlene died one night when she was 9 months old. Crib death, Mom always said. 2 years later, I was born. You were to replace Mary Charlene, Mom said. She told me that she had ordered up a second redhead girl so Lori wouldn't feel like she was weird. You were such a skinny baby, Mom used to tell me. The longest, boniest thing the nurses had ever seen. Brian arrived when I was 1. He was a blue baby, Mom said. When he was born, he couldn't breathe and came out into the world having a seizure. Whenever Mom told the story, she would hold her arms rigid and clench her teeth and go bug-eyed to show how Brian looked. Mom said that when she saw him like that, she thought, uh-oh, looks like this one's a goner too. But Brian lived. For the first year of his life, he kept having these seizures. And then one day, he just stopped. He turned into a tough little guy who never whined or cried. Even the time I accidentally pushed him off the top of the bunk and he broke his nose. Cats! Cats! Stop! Stop! Sorry. Mom always said people worry too much about their children. Suffering when you're young is good for you, she said. It immunized your body and your soul, and that was why she ignored us kids when we cried. Fussing over children who cry only encourages them, she told us. That's positive reinforcement for negative behavior. Mom never seemed upset about Mary Charlene's death. Mom never seemed upset about Mary Charlene's death. God knows what he's doing, she said. He gave me some perfect children, but he also gave me one that wasn't so perfect, he said. Oops, I better take this one back. Dad, however, wouldn't talk about Mary Charlene. If her name came up, his face grew stony and he'd leave the room. He was the one who found her body in a crib, and Mom couldn't believe how much it shook him up. When he found her, he stood there like he was in shock or something, cradling her stiff little body in his arms, and then he screamed like a wounded animal, she told us. I never heard such a horrible sound. Mom said Dad was never the same after Mary Charlene died. He started having dark moods, staying out late and coming home drunk and losing jobs. One day soon after Brian was born, we were short on cash, so Dad pawned Mom's big diamond wedding ring, which her mother had paid for, and that upset Mom. After that, whenever Mom and Dad got in a fight, Mom brought up the ring, and Dad told her to quit her damn belly aching. He said that he was going to get her a ring even fancier than the one he'd pawned, and that's why he had to find gold to get Mom a new wedding ring. And so we could build the glass castle. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and the next section is, do you always like moving around? So that will be Glass Castle section 5, which I think takes us to the end of week 2 of school. So stay tuned for the next video.